Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca. I wanted to catch up with you all with a book that I recently read and loved and wanted to highlight, and that is When the Sleeper Wakes by H.G. Wells. Wells obviously is a huge name, but I picked this up for Victober because this was written and published in the Victorian era, the end of the 1800s. I think this was written in 1890 and published in 1899. And so it has, and I was expecting it to have that sense of uncertainty about the end of the century, that sort of turn of the century, looking forward with hope, but also the end of the Victorian era. They knew Victoria was aging at that point and looking forward in hope and trepidation. And that is very present here. But one of the things I didn't foresee in this is that, or I didn't connect the dots, is that it was also the Gilded Age. And that I think is even more present here and makes this even more timely in my reading in current day US in 2025. So this felt like a very timely work, and it is a work of science fiction in the very classic sense. I can see a lot of influences potentially to this book. So the story here, we begin in the first just two chapters of before times, more or less. So it's occurring in 1890. We're with a character who's unnamed at that point, but we find out he's the main character, Graham. He's extremely forlorn and feels like he has nothing, feels lack of hope for the world, and is contemplating taking his own life. And a stranger, Isbister, comes upon him, and this is a businessman who is trying to talk him out of his despair. And as they're talking, they sort of agree that he's going to come away and everything's going to be all right. But he lays down and goes to sleep and does not wake up. And then in chapter 2, we're following Isbister, who was a complete stranger to Graham, the sleeper, and the sleeper's cousin, Warming, as they are sort of generally chatting, coming together. Apparently some time has passed and the sleeper is still sleeping, and they've had some camaraderie over that fact that they both have been connected to the sleeper in some way. And so they're musing about the idea that, well, if he just keeps sleeping, we're going to need to appoint some guardians for him. We're going to need to do something, set up a trust or something for his estate. And so they're musing about the problems they need to solve for him, more or less. And then chapter 3, we jump to 200 years later. The sleeper is waking. Graham is finally awake, and he has time traveled the slow way by actually sleeping through 200 years. And so at that point, we do finally get some agency a bit from Graham, but I would say this is not a character-driven novel at all. This is a novel of ideas. And as a character, he's sort of just a vehicle for us, the reader, to flow through this deluge of an onslaught of this new world of the future. And it is so fantastic what is being explored here in that aspect, because it's pretty purely speculative. These are all things that maybe were just being invented, but the ways that they're envisioned, technologies of the future, are so relatable to present day or things that have been developed. Things like airplane travel being fairly commonly accessible and all over the skies. Like, that would not have been in anyone's mind at that point, other than as speculation. It was not a reality, and yet here he has realized it. Everything from electricity to central air, he does so much to get across the development of technology and the ways the world works now that are things that have become very relatable and real. So in one section, he's just sort of seeing the city for the first time. There were no windows, and he began to recall that along all the vast chambers and passages he had traversed with Howard, he had observed no windows at all. Had there been windows? There were windows on the street indeed, but were they for light? Or was the whole city lit day and night forevermore, so that there was no night there? And another thing dawned on him. There was no fireplace in either room. Was the season summer? And were these merely summer apartments, or was the whole city uniformly heated or cooled? He became interested in these questions, began examining the smooth texture of the walls, the simply constructed bed, the ingenious arrangements by which the labor of bedroom service was practically abolished. And over everything was a curious absence of deliberate ornament, a bare grace of form and color that he found very pleasing to the eye. There were several very comfortable chairs, a light table on silent runners carrying several bottles of fluids and glasses, and 2 plates bearing a clear substance like jelly. Then he noticed there were no books, no newspapers, no writing materials. The world was changed indeed, he said. He observed one entire side of the outer room was set with rows of peculiar double cylinders inscribed with green lettering on white that harmonized with the decorative scheme of the room, and in the center of this side projected a little apparatus about a yard square and having a white, smooth face to the room. A chair faced this. He had a transitory idea that these cylinders might be books, or a modern substitute for books, but at first it did not seem so. So he starts examining those things. He puzzled over this peculiar cylinder for some time and replaced it. Then he turned it to the square apparatus and examined that. He opened a sort of lid and found one of the double cylinders within, and on the upper edge a little stud like the stud of an electric bell. He pressed this and a rapid clicking began and ceased. He became aware of voices and music and noticed a play of color on the smooth front face. He suddenly realized what this might be and stepped back to regard it. On the flat surface was now a little picture, very vividly colored, and in this picture were figures that moved. Not only did they move, but they were conversing in clear, small voices. It was exactly like reality viewed through an inverted opera glass and heard through a long tube. So he's really speculating about things that either were just barely being invented or were completely in the realm of fiction at that point. So it's really wonderful to read through and see all of these amazing technologies that he dreams up, and the ways that he imagines a future world could work. So this initially seems like a utopia to him. So he is being led around by the people in power because he's sort of been mythologized at this point. Over 200 years, the entire world has come to know his face, and everyone views him as somewhat supernatural. He's entered into the public consciousness around the world, and the people in power have sort of kept him alive very much. And so they're leading him around, catering to his every whim, but we still don't know really anything about him. However, details start to slip. He's mainly being kept in these rooms, but increasingly encounters other people and starts asking questions. And as he's asking questions, he's hearing that a lot of things are working very differently from the way he's just being told by those in power or is seeing in the areas of the city that he's seeing so far. So I think that reminds me a huge amount of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed. I would be very, very surprised if she was not influenced by this book, in fact. So in that book, we sort of have this character who's a scholar who goes from one planet that works a very particular way to another planet that works a very different way. And he's sort of kept cloistered in isolation in his rooms for scholarly pursuits. And as he is able to get out and go see more of the world, like he has this wonder for the place that he's in and can see a lot of the positives and is being propagandized about those positives. So he seems a little naive, but then quickly things start falling into place where he's recognizing that, oh, things are very different from the way they're being portrayed, and I'm actually being kept separated from what's going on in this world. And that's very much the case here. So moving into more towards spoilery aspects of this, though it's a classic that most people have either decided they're not going to read or have read already, probably, or don't care about spoilers at all. Moving into those Gilded Age aspects that I was mentioning, that's the very spoilery part. So at its core, what has gone on over those 200 years in that early scene where we saw Warming and Isbister casually discussing the need to have some care for the trust and guardianship of the sleeper. What's happened is that, in fact, we have a massive oligarchy where his trust just grew and grew out of control. And even as it was overtaking entire businesses and monopolizing everything, even to the point of overtaking whole countries, nobody was stopping it. And just the power of that trust was growing to the point that all the power came to be owned by the sleeper through his council. So in fact, it is the council that are the politicians that are in power that also are in business owners of the entire world, basically. And so this touches on so many relevant topics for today about the amassing of power under business. So here he's talking to this old man who is kind of like, kids these days don't know their history kind of deal, and yet doesn't realize that this is the sleeper somehow. I think his vision's not good, but he's sort of regaling him with the history as Graham is asking these questions, pulling out finally the answers to who the people in power are. You must know he had a cousin named Warming, a solitary man without children, who made a big fortune speculating in roads, the first Edomite roads. But surely you've heard, no? Why, he bought all the patent rights and made a big company. In those days, there were grosses of separate businesses and business companies. Grosses of grosses. His roads killed the railroads, the old things, in 24 years. He bought up and Edomited the tracks, and because he didn't want to break up his great property or let in shareholders, he left it all to the sleeper and put it under a board of trustees that he had picked and trained. He knew then the sleeper wouldn't wake, that he would go on sleeping and sleeping till he died. He knew that quite well. And Plump, a man in the United States who had lost 2 sons in a boating accident, followed that up with another great bequest. His trustees found themselves with 12 myriads of lions worth, or more, of property at the very beginning. What was his name? Graham. No, I mean the Americans. Isbister. Isbister, cried Graham. Why, I don't even know the name. Of course not, said the old man. Of course not. People don't learn much in schools nowadays. But I know all about him. He was a rich American who went from England, and he left the sleeper even more than Warming. How he made it, that I don't know. Something about pictures by machinery, but he made it and left it. And so the council had its start. It was just a council of trustees at first. And how did it grow? You're not up on things. Money attracts money, and 12 brains are better than 1. They played it cleverly. They worked politics with money, and they kept on adding to the money by working currency and tariffs. They grew, and for years the 12 trustees hid the growing of the sleeper's estate under double names and company titles and all that. The council spread by title deed, mortgage, share. Every political party, every newspaper, they bought. If you listen to the old stories, you will see the council growing and growing. Billions and billions of lions at last, the sleeper's estate, and all growing out of a whim, out of this Warming's will, and an accident to Isbister's sons. Men are strange, said the old man. The strange thing to me is how the council worked together for so long. As many as 12, but they worked in cliques from the first, and they've slipped back. In my young days, speaking of the council was like an ignorant man speaking of God. We didn't think they could do wrong. We didn't know of their women and all that, or else I've got wiser. So there are even conspiracy theories around that talk about how maybe the sleeper was actually dead and replaced at points in order for these people to keep power. So it's very interesting to see that kind of mindset surrounding this mythos of the sleeper. As well, we then get some more details about how they've managed to keep this power over such a long period of time without challenge. The natural consequence of a swarming constituency is the rule of the party organization. Power was passing, even in the Victorian time, to the party machinery, secret, complex, and corrupt. Very speedily, power was in the hands of great men of business who financed the machines. A time came when the real power and interest of the empire rested visibly between the 2 party councils, ruling by newspapers and electoral organizations, 2 small groups of rich and able men, working at first in opposition, then presently together. The urgent necessity of either capturing or depriving the party councils of power is a common suggestion underlying all the thoughtful work of the early 20th century, both in America and England. In most of these things, America was a little earlier than England, though both countries drove the same way. That counter-revolution never came. It could never organize and keep pure. There was not enough of the old sentimentality, the old faith in righteousness left among men. Any organization that became big enough to influence the polls became complex enough to be undermined, broken up, or bought outright by the capable rich men. Scholastic and popular, reactionary and purity parties were all, at last, mere stock exchange counters, selling their principles to pay for their electioneering. And the great concern of the rich was naturally to keep property intact, the board clear for the game of trade, just as the feudal concern had been to keep the board clear for hunting and war. The whole world was exploited, a battlefield of businesses and financial convulsions, the scourge of currency manipulation, tariff wars, made more human misery during the 20th century because the wretchedness was dreary life instead of speedy death, than had war, pestilence, and famine in the darkest hours of the earlier history. So it then goes on to talk through how they monopolized the entire world into this singular council's power under the sleeper. And it's so powerful because the sleeper initially doesn't know what to do. And in the course of this, he quickly learns that there is a revolution coming, that there are people who want to support him in overthrowing the council and turn things over. And so he rallies behind this. There's a singular revolutionary, Ostrog, who's been working behind the scenes for multiple years to try and make the case, because it increasingly becomes apparent that there is a labor class that is effectively slavery. These people who have nothing and will never have anything, despite all of the social progressions to an egalitarian society where they've made a lot of progress to equality, to having their needs met, but yet they still have nothing and have very little freedom. And as he's realizing that, as he is going along with Ostrog, this revolutionary, it becomes apparent that Ostrog wants revolution just so he can have power, so he can control the world. He wants to use the Sleeper as his pawn to take over and rule, because all they can imagine in their future is oppression by someone else, really. And that's a heartbreaking way to take it. So that all feels very hopeless, but the big spoiler, this is the real spoiler of the book. In the end, the Sleeper, with his Victorian ideals and his hopefulness for the future, socializes everything. He owns everything. He has all of this property, and he disperses his businesses back to the people, effectively. He declares that the people are the owners of everything rather than the companies. And we don't really get to see that play out, so that was a little bit of a disappointment, because I would have loved to see that sort of utopian, hopeful ending. And yet it is such a big, dramatic finish for him to declare that. So I just really liked this as a novel ideas. It's probably not my favorite H.G. Wells, and almost certainly not a starting point with Wells, because it's a little bit more abstract than his other work. But I loved it. I will give one caveat, in that there is some pretty strong white supremacy, very definite racist ideas, and is that the character, is that Wells being immersed in the mores of the time? I don't know, and I'm not going to significantly judge the book on that characteristic, but I will say it's pretty overt and it is present. It's not throughout, but definitely significant moments surrounding white supremacy. I really feel like this is an underrated classic of Wells' work, because I just don't see people picking it up or talking about it. And when I grabbed it for Victober, I did have multiple people who were really interested in hearing about it, because they also have not really heard anybody talk about it. So he's always a visionary. Really and truly, I think his sci-fi work is leaps and bounds ahead of so many things that are done modern day, where he was really thinking about things that were unreal in a speculative way that made them feel real. And he did that here. He made a whole world that is just completely unreal and shouldn't be tangible, and yet it very much is tangible. And he takes us through the overwhelm that our character Graham goes through in experiencing that for the first time. And it's so wondrous and horrible at the same time, and yet so much of it has come to pass to be in some way real. Even things as little as like automatic doors he has here, like in a world where they didn't even have household electricity. That is wild and amazing that he was able to envision that. So yes, H.G. Wells, unsurprisingly, is a visionary. That's about what my broadcast for this video is. So highly recommend people check this out if they are at all interested in reading some more Wells and getting to a great backlist classic. Thank you so very much for watching.